everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Harry Truman, and the focus is second term. The year is 1949, and Truman is coming off of his somewhat surprising but successful re-election campaign in 1948, getting his own 4 years as President of the United States. There would be some changes, though, as he's heading into that second term, including in the cabinet. The top spot in the cabinet, George Marshall, was stepping down, leaving government. He had a number of health issues, so he was going to step away. Dean Acheson coming back to government to serve as Secretary of State. Marshall and Acheson, of the 24 people who served as cabinet secretaries for Truman in his almost 8 years in office, it was Marshall and Acheson that were really the top two that he trusted the most in terms of the counsel that they gave him. Speaking of counsel, his counsel to the president, Clifford, was also going to be stepping aside, leaving government to kind of replenish his finances a little bit before he would eventually come back to government. Also in the cabinet, Lewis Johnson was coming in as Secretary of Defense. James Forrestal was going to be stepping down. Now for Harry Truman, he's got his 4 years coming as his own term as president, but he would not be living in the White House during those 4 years. Why not? Well, mainly because the White House was essentially falling apart. In the previous term, Truman had actually made a significant addition to the White House. The Truman balcony on the second floor overlooking the South Lawn, that was still in good shape. The third floor also was in pretty good shape, but the rest of the White House, the structural damage was simply unsound, is what the experts were saying. In fact, one of the pieces of evidence of that was Margaret Truman's piano. A leg on that piano actually fallen through the floor. People were worried about sort of what was going to happen next. So Truman said, enough's enough. We got to fix this thing once and for all. He went to Congress. They approved the funding and the program to actually renovate the White House. The easiest thing actually probably would have been just to tear the whole thing down and start over, but Truman was not interested in that. He wanted to retain, if nothing else, he wanted to retain the outside structure and the walls. So what they did was they were just going to strip it down to the studs and then build it back up, largely based on the original model. This was important to Truman. He said, I'm very much interested in the proper replacement of the furniture in the White House and the manner in which it should be placed. Since I'm the only president in 50 years who's had any interest whatever in the rehabilitation of the White House, I'm going to see that it is done properly and correctly. He actually spent a fair amount of time, hands-on, almost every day throughout the renovation, working on that project. It was a good distraction for him because he had a bunch of other stuff going on. They would add about from 62 rooms, it would be over 100 after the renovation was completed. A lot of that happening below ground. They added some basements, including the famous bomb shelter. Truman was told that it should withstand a blast from an atomic bomb as long as it wasn't a direct hit. That they couldn't guarantee. Otherwise, though, he thought the president could be safe in there. And so they would continue this after about a year of planning, finally kicked off the renovation project December 13th of 1949. So where were the Trumans going to live? Well, just across the street, across Pennsylvania Avenue in Blair House. Truman would cross that street. He'd walk across a couple of times a day. The ones who were most concerned about this, it wasn't the Trumans, it was the Secret Service. They were concerned that this move away from the White House and the protective security within that building was going to expose Truman. He didn't seem to be concerned. January of 1949, Truman had a couple of major speeches, his State of the Union address and his inaugural address. In the former, the State of the Union, he talked a lot about domestic issues and a pretty bold agenda he was putting on the table that he called the fair deal. It was sort of taking FDR's New Deal to a different level. And he had some success in this area, particularly with the expansion of access to the Social Security program. He also had some improvements in the minimum wage, also some benefits and some safeguards for child labor that were passed. But this was tough on the domestic agenda for Truman because even though the Democrats had retaken control of Congress, a lot of the Southern Democrats simply were not aligned with Truman's agenda. Those Dixiecrats who had supported Thurman in the previous election in particular, and they often sided with the Republicans. It was difficult for Truman to get stuff through in this Congress, despite the fact that the majorities were with the Democrats. One area that they did have progress was an area where Truman had been working with Herbert Hoover. Now, if we recall from an earlier episode, Truman had called Hoover to ask for some help right when he took over the presidency to help in post-World War II Europe that was facing starvation. Hoover was the expert. He had been sort of a political pariah for a dozen years during the Roosevelt years, but Truman brought him back and he got a lot of help from Hoover. They kind of hit it off. They got along well. They had a correspondence going. And there was an issue here with the executive branch. It had gotten really unwieldy, very inefficient. All these new agencies of the New Deal, chain of command was sort of all over the place. And Truman said, look, I want to fix this. Who better than Herbert Hoover? So we got Congress to approve something that they called the Commission on the Organization of the Executive Branch of Government. Everybody called it the Hoover Commission because he ran it and he was very much involved with just about every detail. And for several months, they investigated the situation and came back with recommendations. Now, they held off in delivering those until after the election. That was the original plan, to kind of keep politics out of this. But now here in 1949, it's time to put forward 280 recommendations, and Congress in this case, basically in a bipartisan fashion, just like the bipartisan nature of a Hoover and Truman collaboration, passed and authorized about 70% of those recommendations, made a significant difference in the efficiency in the running of government, especially obviously in the executive branch. Again, this pairing between Hoover and Truman is a bit odd given their backgrounds, but they were both very much aligned on a number of things. They respected each other, they got along pretty well, and they actually had a pretty good friendship. And so when people would ask Truman about Hoover, he sometimes got a little bit defensive. This came out in his oral biography with Merle Miller later on in his life, and he said, "Don't you ever cast any aspersions on Mr. Hoover, because he's done some very important things for this country and the world." And he later added to Miller, "You be careful about what you say about Mr. Hoover, because he's a friend of mine." So an odd pairing, but they would be friends for the rest of their lives. January 20th of 1949 is Inauguration Day. Margaret Truman called it Truman's Day of Days. And if there was one day out of his whole presidency, which is a very difficult job, a lot of stress and headaches, that he could enjoy, it was this day. And he enjoyed it from morning until well after midnight. Started out with breakfast with 98 of his former colleagues and comrades in arms from Battery D from World War I. They came to Washington, D.C. with their wives, had breakfast with the president, and they actually marched in the inaugural parade, sort of an honorary honor guard, flanking Truman's limousine as it made its way from the Capitol to the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue. So they're very much part of this celebration. The inaugural crowd was huge. 100 million people tuned in on the radio, and television also carried it to some cities. About 14 million people saw it on TV. Truman, in this case, talked more about international affairs, and he talked about the East-West divide. Communism subjects the individual to arrest without lawful cause, he said, punishment without trial, and forced labor as the chattel of the state. It decrees what information he shall receive, what art he shall produce, what leaders he shall follow, and what thoughts he shall think. Democracy maintains that government is established for the benefit of the individual and is charged with the responsibility of protecting the rights of the individual and his freedom in the exercise of those abilities. This Cold War very much in front, and Truman was signaling, look, this is probably going to still be with us going forward here in my full term. The rest of the day, well, Truman presided over the inaugural parade. He had a grand old time. The inaugural ball that night, now Truman wasn't a dancer, so he didn't get on the dance floor with Bess, but he was there with family and friends well past midnight. Again, it was his day of days. The next day, though, straight back to work. Serious stuff going on. The Berlin airlift was continuing because the Soviet blockade of Berlin was continuing. There had been talk of a defense alliance that was sort of bubbling up in the democracies in Western Europe, and now it was kind of coming to fruition. A dozen countries, democracies from Western Europe, plus the United States and Canada, formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization we now know as NATO. Again, a dozen members initially, and France and Italy were part of this, which was important because they had been teetering on whether or not to go communist. They made the decision not to, and now they're part of NATO. This was an unprecedented kind of arrangement for the United States when Truman signed this, and the Truman administration signed this in a ceremony in Washington in April of 1949. This was a mutual defense pact. If you attack one, you attacked them all, and the expectation was the other NATO members would come to your defense. The United States had never been involved in something like this before. Question was, would the U.S. Senate support the treaty? They did. 82-13, pretty overwhelming, as this East-West divide was sort of dominating a lot of the thinking. The following months, the Soviets ended that blockade of Berlin. They basically saw after 2 years it wasn't really working. They also had another piece of news. They tested successfully an atomic bomb. So that 4-year monopoly that the United States had on nuclear weapons, that was now over. And the question for Harry Truman was, would they pursue the next piece of technology, an H-bomb, a thermonuclear hydrogen bomb? bomb that used fusion technology instead of fission. According to the scientists, this would be even much more powerful than the initial bombs, and the advisors were actually split on whether or not to pursue it. There were pros and cons of nuclear weapons, and that was felt within the scientific community and in other parts of government. But Harry Truman basically got to the bottom line. He asked the key question, can the Russians do it? And the answer basically came back, well, they're very likely going to pursue it, and Truman said, in that case, we have no choice, we'll go ahead. The United States successfully tested the H-bomb in 1952 on Truman's watch. The Soviets came along 3 years later with their version in 1955. Now, the fear of the Russians and the communists wasn't happening just overseas, also happening in the United States, thanks in part to some high-profile espionage cases. Klaus Fuchs had been infiltrating in the Manhattan Project, in the atomic bomb project, feeding information back to the Soviets. That had come out. The Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, were actually executed after being convicted of spying and handing over secrets to the Russians. And then you had the case of the longtime State Department employee Alger, who was convicted of perjury related to him also providing secrets to the Russians. So Harry Truman wasn't ignoring this potential for infiltration of communists in government, and he established the Federal Employment and Security Program. They looked at 4 million federal employees and prospective employees for perhaps ties that would call into question their honesty and loyalty to the United States. Charges were brought up against 9,077 people. They held 961 hearings that led to 378 people being either denied unemployment or dismissed. That's 378 out of 4 million. Nobody through this program was indicted. A lot of people were uncomfortable with this program. It felt like a witch hunt, neighbor spying on neighbor, but it was nothing like what was going on in the United States Congress. Congress had established the House Un-American Activities Committee, and frankly, when they made an accusation, that was enough alone to basically ruin careers, ruin lives. People were basically assumed to be guilty. If you took the Fifth Amendment, your constitutional right, you basically were blacklisted. Truman was disgusted by all this. He said that the Un-American Activities Committee in the House of Representatives was the most un-American thing in America. It made a mockery of the Bill of Rights and was a long step toward totalitarianism. But he was basically powerless to do anything when it came to a congressionally led investigation. And things were about to get worse in the United States Senate, because the junior senator from Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy, in February of 1950 in Wheeling, West Virginia, came out with this sort of out-of-the-blue accusation. While I cannot take the time to name all the men in the State Department who have been named as members of the Communist Party and members of a spy ring, he said, I have here in my hand a list of 205 that were known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party and who nevertheless are still working and shaping the policy of the State Department. Well, Joe McCarthy out there really good at grabbing headlines, not so good as providing evidence. He never really said who those 205 people were. There were no names associated with it. But again, this was about headline grabbing, fear, and it was being fostered. Truman, again, was disgusted by this. On his vacation in Key West on March the 30th of 1950, he denounced McCarthy. He would continue denouncing McCarthy as this back and forth would go on for the rest of his second term. This was on the annoyance level, but couldn't really compare to the real threat because the communists were about to pick up arms. That's the story for another day. That's Harry Truman and Second Term from the Life of Harry Truman. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher and this is Presidential Chronicles.